The sound inside Sam Greer's saloon was glass and breath, and the soft shuffle of boots on splintered floorboards. It was late afternoon on June heat, and the doors stood open to Last Chance Gulch. John Keene leaned on the bar with his hat tilted low, eyes on the mirror where the whole room fit into a long, warped ribbon. He had come into Helena with dust on his cuffs and a temper packed tight as dry powder. When Harry Slater stepped in out of the glare and saw him, the talking stopped enough that you could hear the flies. Their quarrel started years before in Utah over money and pride, the kind that grows teeth by retelling. Slater put a hand on his hip. Keene's shoulder lifted just enough. The barkeep said the word "fellows" once and then ducked. Keene's pistol flashed in the mirror. The shot threw Slater backward into a chair that went out from under him, the back of his head hitting the floor with the dull knock of wood. There was no second shot. There didn't need to be. Keene did not run. He turned and set his pistol on the bar like a man finished with a tool, and then walked up Bridge Street under a sky the color of brass to give himself to Sheriff George Wood. On paper, it was an easy case. A crowded room, a fresh body, a confession as short as a weather report. In practice, it was a test for a brand new town that had only just named itself and was still building walls faster than it could make laws. Helena had been born the summer before, when 4 men, broke and stubborn, scratched a creek for gold and found enough to rename a bend in the gulch after luck. Cabins climbed the hills in a rash. Sluice timbers stripped the nearest pines bare until one big ponderosa stood almost alone on the ridge west of camp, the last tall thing between raw sky and 1,000 claims. With no judge yet assigned, miners did as miners had always done. They called a court and chose a man to sit the chair and keep order. Stephen Reynolds, steady and clean, presided while a jury of 12, several of them the same men who had ridden in vigilante pauses down in Alder Gulch the year before, heard what everyone already knew. Witnesses spoke into a room that smelled of sweat, whiskey, and the day's last light. The barkeep told how Slater walked in and Keene fired. A woman who had been sweeping the stoop remembered the silence after. Keene said his piece about an old wrong that had ripened into this, and then stopped because there was nothing to add that would change the sound of a shot in a small room. Guilty came back without fuss. The sentence did not mention the tree, but everyone knew where it would be carried out. The big pine had already gathered a kind of gravitational pull, close to town, strong lower branches, a clear approach. A rope and a crossbar could look like law if you believed in what brought you there. In the half-light, Keene walked up the slope with a ring of men around him. Some in that circle wore the memory of the Alder Gulch hangings like a badge. Others wore it like a weight. Keene asked for a prayer. Someone obliged. There were women at the edge of the crowd because Helena was not only a camp of men anymore. Kids watched from the schoolyard up the hill because children will watch anything a town calls important. When the knot tightened and Keene's boots found air, a murmur moved through the crowd that was not quite satisfaction and not yet regret. They called that ponderosa the hangman's tree after that night, and did not pretend they had not. It stood out because miners had eaten the country's trees down to stumps for cribbing, sluices, and fires, and because men kept needing a place where a final decision could look simple. Helena's official courts arrived late that summer, when a federal judge finally made it up the Missouri and across the hills to sit the 3rd District bench. His docket was a chaos of claims, assaults, and arguments about who owned water when there wasn't enough. The rumor of law settled some men. It annoyed others. Between the promise of trials and the memory of Alder Gulch, Helena made itself a committee of safety, neighbors with rifles and a clerk, half civic guard and half old habit. The line between justice and vengeance thinly separates who stands under the limb and who holds the rope. In the months after Keene's hanging, the town learned how easy it is to slide across it. Thieves worked the trails into camp in pairs, trailing dust and stories. Thefts from sluice boxes grew bold. A stage rolled in shot to pieces. Men swore they'd seen faces from the road agent gangs farther south, and the names of Bannock and Virginia City got repeated in rooms where whiskey made memory more certain than it ought to be. When a man was caught with another man's poke and a pistol that matched the notch on a robbery note, the talk in the saloons grew short. Some nights the numerals 3-7-77, meaning whatever a man swore they meant, appeared chalked on fences and sheds, not yet a tradition, but already a threat that worked because it didn't need translation. The tree took more lives. You can write their names as if a list makes them equal, but the stories do not match. One night it was a killer pulled hot from a cell after a woman died in a shack built on a claim she never wanted to live on. Another evening, it was a thief who needed a confession for the crowd to breathe. Sometimes the men were guilty by any measure. Sometimes a hasty certainty did work that a judge would have slowed. A farmer hauling split rails into town made the mistake of walking past the tree at dusk with his head down. Later he told anyone who would listen that the faces closest to the rope were gray long before the drop. Schoolchildren could see the limb from their yard at Rodney and Broadway. A girl who recited her sums one morning stood at the fence line that afternoon with her hands clasped behind her back and watched two bodies sway in a wind that took a long time to start up the hill. Mary Ronan, who later wrote about the town, carried those images into old age with perfect recall for the angle of light and the way men spoke softly when the thing was finished. When Helena dressed up for its spring parade years later, floats rolled down Last Chance Gulch, and school bands played while somewhere, not so far away, teachers could still walk their classes to the hill and point at the empty place where the tree had stood. By 66 and 67, with sawmills chewing steadily and capital moving in, Helena wanted to be a city and not a camp that happened to have sidewalks. Courts ran more surely. The district attorney wore his worry on his face like a sunburn when juries refused to convict men the street had already sentenced. The committee still met at night, less to hang than to remind. Warnings folded into the town's language. A note tacked to a door might do what a rope once did. But Helena's idea of itself had already been shaped by the way the crowd looked up at that limb. Businessmen ordered stone and brick for new storefronts. Carpenters switched from lean-tos to two-story frames. Even so, people still glanced up the hill when a rumor started. For some, the tree meant safety, the place where the dangerous learned that Helena would not wait for court terms and traveling judges. For others, it meant the opposite, not protection, but appetite, the way a crowd can go quiet and efficient when given a task it has convinced itself is clean. By the late 1860s, the trunk was scarred by rope, and the ground under it was scuffed bare. Claims pushed houses up against the slope. Someone with a saw and a sense of what the town ought to become cut the tree down around the end of the decade. The stump weathered. The slope sprouted fences. A generation later, a boy playing marbles there would be told by a man on a porch that this was where men once learned the price of theft. The boy's sister, less impressed, would say the price depended on who you knew. The story did not end because the tree ended. It moved into how people talked about Helena and about Montana itself. A badge later carried an old set of numbers. Streets filled once a year for a parade that helped children rehearse a story of courage that did not always match the record. Old-timers swore that dozens had met their end under that limb. The fact that the count was lower did not keep the feeling from being real. The work of civic life, juries, judges, and laws written in rooms without whiskey, took the weight the limb had carried. But on certain evenings when the wind came down off the hills just so, and dust rose along the gulch like smoke, People found themselves looking toward a patch of sky where nothing stood anymore and seeing it anyway. The Hanging Tree of Helena was not a myth. It was a living thing used to do a hard, final job because a town was in a hurry. Sometimes that hurry kept people safe. Sometimes it made a terrible mistake fast. The difference between justice and vengeance was measured out there in rope and breath, and in the faces of the people who went home afterward and tried to sleep. If you stand on that hill now and listen, you will hear the city talking, traffic on the gulch, voices drifting up from bars that have forgotten the names taped to their windows long ago. You won't hear the rope, but the silence that followed it still has a shape. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.